what is going to be, or what is, the final stream of January. Pretty crazy that we are already through this month. It is like the longest month of the year. Definitely feels that way. But it's crazy that we've already done like 4 streams now through the new year of 2025. So happy to be back again this week. Today's January 28th. And today we're going to be talking about sequencing your album, EP, just any project that you're putting together. When I had the topic in mind, I specifically thought of albums because I know albums require a lot more thought and effort. They're usually a bit longer. Most albums nowadays are anywhere from 7 to probably 15 songs, and then obviously there's deluxe versions that people do where they pretty much add in 5 to 10 other songs on top of the already released music. So albums could be anywhere from like 7 all the way to like 25, which is crazy. I'm not a big fan of longer albums, and I also miss the days where deluxe albums were shorter. Like they would only add on like 2 bonus tracks. Now they add on like a whole new album. I don't understand why that's a thing other than streaming being, a big prevalent thing. But I never understood why, artists do that. But regardless, it doesn't matter the length, because these tips that we're going to talk about today are pretty much good for any type of project you're putting together, even if it is an EP with like 5 songs. So I ended up finding a few articles. The main one we're going to go over today is from Musicians Union. It's called Industry Insights, How to Sequence a Music Album, the MU. I found a couple others as well, which I will leave in the description of the YouTube replay. But we're going to go over this one today because I thought this one was the most in-depth one. It says, deciding which tracks should go where in the running order of an album can be pivotal. 2 artists and 1 producer tell us what works for them. And this is by Neil Crossley. It is almost a year to the date is when this was published. This was published on January 26th of last year. So it's about a year old at this point, but very relevant. And this is stuff that, doesn't really, I guess technically doesn't ever go out of style or out of relevancy. But, certain terminology probably will. So it says, in an era of digital streaming, the whole concept of listening to an album from start to finish might seem like an archaic pastime, but the impact of album sequencing, the order in which the tracks appear on an album, has not diminished for artists and their fans. Great sequencing can enhance and elevate an album, with each track complementing the other, adding dynamism, that's a weird one, and pace, leading the listener smoothly on a musical journey. Sequencing is the final creative decision before the album is mastered and will probably involve the producer and maybe the label or management, but it ultimately rests on the artist. Sequencing should be fun, and that's how Nigel Polsford, former guitarist with the band Bush, remembers it. He says, it's a fun problem to confront. In my old band, we would write the song titles down on pieces of card and try to get the sequence right the first time. But for many artists immersed in their own albums, it can be an arduous process. I never find it easy, says songwriter Robert Vincent, who has worked with producer Ethan Johns on his last 2 albums. With my album, In This Town You're Owned, Ethan had written the songs he thought were the strongest to record in no particular order with a backup list. So the album pretty much went down as per the list, bar one song as far as I can remember. So that was pretty painless and also very organic. So basically, it sounds like both of those people are more of the traditional write it down. Again, the method doesn't really matter. I've said this in other streams. Whatever works for you works for you. You could type it on your notes app on your phone. You could have a whiteboard. I keep a whiteboard, actually. I don't keep it for sequencing. I used to do this with my artist J Trey. Like when we did his first couple albums, we would write down the track lists on the whiteboard though, and we would like come up with the order and everything. We do it a little bit differently now. We do it just via text or the notes app. But a whiteboard is good because especially if you're in a band or a group like they're talking about, you can go over the ideas in person, with the whiteboard and change things in real time and everybody can see it. Another thing I thought about doing, or that you could do, is maybe like a PowerPoint. If you had some type of like a way to project the ideas onto a wall or a whiteboard or anything like that, or just some type of what do they call it, smart boards, if they even make those anymore. That was from when I was a kid. They had smart boards, and they would you could pull anything up on your computer, you could put it on the smart board, and then you could interact with it in real time using the board. So you can highlight things and do things like that. Maybe there's something like that you could do that's a little bit more in depth, but I think that's a good thing to do. Sequencing an album is a subjective process. It's worth noting that there are no rights or wrongs when it comes to sequencing an album. It's a subjective process driven by the creative aims of the artist. But there are guidelines that it's worth observing when turning your collection of tracks into a coherent single work of art. Whatever sequence you choose, the order should reflect the theme and emotion of the album and provide some kind of story or journey, whether that is lyrically, musically, and or emotionally. I'm probably going to skip a lot of the talking bits in this because there's a lot of the pieces with Vincent and what was this guy's name? Robert. Robert and what was the other guy's name? Nigel. So a lot of the Nigel-Robert dialogue, I'm probably going to skip a lot of that and just get to the main points because it is a lot. But essentially what they're talking about is, if your album has the theme or the concept, usually you'll come up with that first. So you're already going to know, what are these tracks supposed to be talking about. And most of the tracks will probably already have names anyway. Then it's just kind of fleshing out that full idea into something a little bit more in depth, which I think you'd have to sit with each song and just kind of, pick each song apart a little bit as far as the story goes and what is the story you're trying to tell. And usually stories start with, a good beginning, they have a good middle, and they have a good end. So it's about identifying those three parts of whatever story you are trying to tell. So that's kind of what I take from this is just, no matter what it is, it doesn't really matter what the theme is. It's just trying to capture that and really just bottle that emotion, but make people feel it in the right way. Because if things are out of order, it might change the way your story's told, and you don't necessarily want that. The album should have a natural progression. Pacing and dynamics are integral to successful sequencing. Too much of the same thing quickly becomes boring. In many ways, sequencing begins before you even record your first note, when you are selecting the tracks to include on the album. Strident, pacey tracks should be complemented by more intimate, reflective songs, and there should be a mix of time signatures and tempos across the album. Interludes and fades can be a useful tool in breaking up an album, but overusing them can equally disrupt the flow. The album should have a logical and natural progression, with each song complementing the next in a manner that elevates the overall experience, as Robert Vincent explained, which he gives a whole quote on his experience with that. Again, back to when I was working on the first few J-Tray projects, I would always suggest to him to start off with like a very memorable intro. So we would try to develop some type of, usually it was some like 2-part song or something, it was either very complex or very simple, but it was something that would make a statement to kind of kick things off. Then you probably go into your single, which is the song you probably put out first. Like track 2 or 3, I always look at that as like that's where the single goes, the song that people are already familiar with. Put that somewhere in there. And then once you reach, depending on the length, of course, I always looked at it as, once you reach like track 5 and 6, that's when you're getting into the real in-depth parts of the story. More of the album cuts, the very memorable songs that people are going to remember within this body of work. They're not necessarily the most popular songs or the radio songs or whatever, but they're the ones that the diehard fans are going to love the most. So that's like in the middle half. Toward the tail end, almost before you get to the outro, is your more emotional songs. So that's where, I would always suggest putting the songs that have like a singer on the hook, or just songs where you're talking about something very personal to you, something that you feel, again, it could be a love song, it could be some type of traumatic song, or just some reflective song on a point in your life that means a lot to you, something like that. And then you kind of close it off with, again, like a memorable song for the outro, and that could be any mix of whatever you conjure up. It doesn't really matter. That's how we always, I feel like, have structured his projects, and that's kind of how I structure my project a little bit. Even though I'm doing instrumental music for the most part, I kind of put that same rule of thumb in there with how I'm doing the sequencing. But I like that, and what I think of too when I hear about the pacing and things like that, I think about movies. How many movies have you watched where the pacing is really bad? Or just like, it doesn't feel like things are moving like a well-oiled machine. Like maybe it starts out really hot, and then by the time you're like an hour in, it just starts to drag on. And the next thing you know, a 2-hour movie feels like a 5-hour movie because the pacing was all wrong. I think it's super important in visual arts to get the pacing right. And I don't think it's any different with music, even though music can do it in a different light, and it can do it with less of a runtime. But that just goes to show, because you have less of a runtime, you really should be trying to think about, how do I utilize this time with the pacing? So I don't know. I think it's just worth kind of seeing the parallels between those worlds. Maybe it's not movies for you. Maybe you think of something else where that could be similar. Just think of how to apply that in your music. And that leads pretty well into the next part of the article, which is the importance of the opening track. It says, when it comes to discussion of sequencing albums, few subjects divide opinions quite like what to choose as the opening track. Certainly the first song can set the tone for the rest of the album, so it's well worth spending time thinking long and hard about what your opening track will be. Music industry data suggests that the earlier a song appears on the album, the more likely a listener is to stream it. In recent years, the term skip rate has been adopted to determine whether listeners make it through the first 30 seconds of a song. After that time, a stream will be registered for royalty purposes. So the objective is to keep the skip rate as low as possible. With that in mind, many industry sources advise artists to lead with your hit, although it may not make the most creative or fluid sequencing. Yeah, I've definitely heard a lot of mixed opinions on this. I personally don't think, again, I can't tell anybody what to do. I would never say lead with the hit. I would just say lead with what feels right, because at the end of the day, it's your project. You have to live with it. If you lead with the hit or something that someone else tells you to do, you're probably going to look back in 15 years and be like, man, I regret doing that. I wish I would have just listened to what I felt was right as the artist. Again, I'm not telling anybody what to do. This is all just my opinion. But just keep that in mind. If you're making an album, especially if you're going to get a physical release done of this album, whatever it is, you're gonna have to live with it forever. It's gonna be out there in the world. You can't take it back. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, I've definitely heard divided opinions, especially with streaming, because yeah, it's like, how many times are you shown a new artist, or someone says, check this artist out, check this album out? You know, if you are the album person, if you enjoy projects, you're gonna listen to it all the way through. But you'll start with the first one, and you'll probably start to form an opinion within those first 20 to 30 seconds. I've done it so many times. Even for artists I've been listening to for years, if it's not hitting me right off the bat, I'm just like, man, I don't know. Like, this kind of might be a bit of a drag. I don't really know what to expect. Hopefully it gets better. But if I feel like the opener doesn't hit me like immediately, I immediately kind of start to drop interest. Like, it is what it is. You know what I mean? So I think it is very important to lead with something that's pretty memorable. And like I said early, lead with something memorable, and preferably close with something memorable. We'll see if they get into that here in a bit. But next up, we have grower or grabber. Lead with whatever feels right. Opening with a hit seems a bit too easy and contrived to me. Okay, we can skip that whole thing. Basically, it's Robert talking about the fact that, basically what I just said, which is, it's not exactly a formula of just like lead with the hit and everything will work out. You kind of have to trust your gut, and this is art at the end of the day. So do what feels right, and just go for it. Like, don't be afraid to make that decision. And you can ask for a second opinion, but just trust your gut. Like, at the end of the day, you know what I mean. So, albums as art forms, like many, Robert Vincent recognizes that the way people listen to records these days has changed with streaming, and because of this, the album has suffered as an art, in my opinion. More and more bands and artists think more in songs than albums, so therefore not really thinking about an album as a body of work. Self and Ethan are very old school on the album as an art form, so we share most of that feeling in the same way. So basically he's talking about, again, streaming has kind of just diluted everything down to, focus on singles. You don't ever drop an album, just drop a bunch of singles consecutively. But again, if you like albums like I do, like a lot of other people do, you're gonna keep making albums. You don't really care that much. You're just gonna keep doing it, and you can still drop singles, of course, and nothing's stopping you from doing that. But if you want to make full bodies of work, that's why this stuff is important. But yes, streaming inevitably has changed the way we look at all this stuff. Mistakes to avoid when sequencing. One common mistake is having too many songs in the same key. Most listeners will not be aware they are in the same key, but they will notice it's all starting to sound the same. Equally, it's important to avoid using similar chord progressions on each track. Always check the way one song goes into another. If one starts with the same chord that the previous song ended with, then maybe the order should change. If you've got a long, intense song, then it's good to have something lighter or less intense after or before to give perspective and even relief. I don't know, I think about a lot of different albums that are sequenced very differently. And a lot of albums that get really like finely sequenced in the mastering stage. An artist that comes to mind is Travis Scott, which, again, Travis Scott, I wouldn't call him a controversial artist, but a lot of people are kind of like, you either hate his music or you really like it. When I was coming up, I was a big Travis fan. I don't think I'm as big of a Travis fan now, but I still respect what he does musically. I think he takes a lot of risks, and I think his style is very unique. I think it always stood out to me. But but his albums have always been very well sequenced. Astroworld, for example, which is probably his most popular one, incredibly sequenced just from start to finish, and it's doing exactly what they're talking about, which it will end a certain song and it'll go so seamlessly into the next one that you don't even know it happened. You know what I mean? And a lot of that comes down to the mastering engineer sitting down at the end and kind of putting two and two together. And they're two completely different songs, but they just fit so seamlessly well. And that's a great example of that. But also what they're saying is, sometimes that might not be the best thing. Maybe you want to switch it up and kind of just, because like we said, this is a story. You have chapters of the story. Sometimes you want to take them from point A to point B, or point B to way over to F. You know what I mean? So it's just things to keep in mind. And then when it says, songs that all sound the same, I think of boy bands like NSYNC, Backstreet Boys. If you go back to the late 90s, early 2000s and listen to a lot of their music, it all sounds the same. It's all in the same key. It's all the same BPM. But every single one of those songs was pretty popular. But they were definitely following like some type of formula. It worked for the time. But now I think it's funny to look back on it, because you could go from one Backstreet Boys song to the next, and it is the same song with slightly different things going on, but it's the exact same thing. It's just crazy to think about. And it's just, certain things will work for certain artists and certain things won't. But I think that's all good things to keep in mind. And you can read the other parts of, that interview that was kind of taking place in this article as well. They're just kind of expanding on the idea of it. But that was the article. It's not a super long read, but I think it is pretty in-depth, and it's just giving you some ideas, some things that, you could use when you're trying to sequence your projects. So let me pull up these other two articles. I'll let you guys know what these are before we get on out of here. This was a bit of a shorter one, just more of a simple topic tonight, but I thought it was a cool topic. The other article, or one of the other articles, is from Carvin Audio. It's called "Finding the Right Song Order for Your Album," and it's a very short article, but again, it kind of briefly touches on some of the things we talked about in the other article, as well as some other little tidbits, just giving you some advice on how to pick songs for your album. And then let me see this other one. The other one is from Disc Makers again. Shout out to Disc Makers. It's from Disc Makers blog. It's called "How to Sequence an Album for Best Results." It's from 2020, so it's about 5 years old. But this one is actually, it's not as long as I thought. There's a lot of comments on this. So you can read the comments if you want, people sharing their experiences. But it is a 7-step process on how they think you should sequence an album, or what would help you to sequence an album. So definitely check those out. They will all be in the YouTube replay description. 3 articles, and again, I hope this helps you if you're cooking up a new project for this year, for later this year, or just maybe you just started a album that's going to be coming out within the next year. Maybe this will help you out, give you some ideas. But I think the biggest thing of all is just use your best judgment and realize that you are the artist. You should trust your gut, trust your intuition, and just go for it and see what happens. At the end of the day, you have to live with your art. Nobody else does. So just do you, and trust it'll all work out. But I hope this was beneficial to you guys. And again, as always, I appreciate you guys for tuning in. We're going to be back next Tuesday. The topic will be the best music apps of 2025. So we're going to be going over some apps that you can get on your smartphone to help you musically in the year 2025. Some of the stuff will probably be from 2024 as well. But what people are looking at, new platforms that people are connecting on, people are monetizing on, all that sort of thing. That'll be pretty fun. That's next Tuesday at February 4th, on February 4th at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. But again, thank you guys for checking this out. Yeah, everything else will be in the description of the replay. So until next time, thank you guys. Happy we're almost through January. See you next month. And have a great rest of the week. Stay safe, stay healthy, all that good stuff. And take care, guys. Peace.